Today we're going to look at one of the most famous stories ever told, but from a completely different angle. We're talking about Moses and how a moment of just catastrophic failure became the very thing that forged him into a hero. So how does a man go from a fugitive to a liberator? Well, let's dive in. So let me ask you this. Have you ever seen something that was just so clearly wrong? At work, in your community, you name it. And you just thought, somebody has to do something. And right in that moment, there's this powerful urge to just take control, right? To force a solution, to get ahead of everybody else, and maybe even get a little ahead of God.
Well, that's the exact spot we find Moses in. He sees this awful injustice, he feels the weight of it, and instead of waiting, instead of listening, he decides to take matters into his own hands.
Okay, so let's get a quick lay of the land. At this point in the story of Exodus, God's people, the Hebrews, have grown into a huge population, just like God promised. But a new Pharaoh comes along, gets scared of their numbers, and clamps down, enslaving them. The suffering is just immense. And yet, through all of this, God is working quietly behind the scenes, miraculously saving the life of a baby boy named Moses. So fast forward, and Moses is now a grown man, and he's been raised with all the privilege of Pharaoh's own house. I mean, he could have just looked the other way, right? Ignored the suffering of the Hebrews. But he doesn't. The text says he went out to his people. Now, that's not just him taking a walk. That's a total shift in his identity. He's choosing their struggle as his own. So before we even get to his huge mistake, we got to see this. His heart is absolutely in the right place. He cares a lot. But what happens when a really good cause is pushed forward with a really bad method? This is where the story takes a sharp turn. It's an act of what you could call flawed zeal. Moses sees an Egyptian beating one of his people, and something inside him just snaps. But listen to this tiny, crucial detail the Bible gives us. He looked this way and that. Now, what's he doing there? Is he praying? Is he seeking God's guidance? Nope. He's scanning for human witnesses. See, this isn't about divine consultation. It's pure human calculation. And this right here, this shows us the huge difference. Following God's call involves seeking Him, waiting for His timing, and relying on His power. What Moses did, that was all human calculation. He acted on impulse. He relied on his own strength, and he just hoped nobody saw. He basically made himself judge, jury, and executioner, and then tried to bury the evidence. So here's the bottom line. A right desire does not justify a wrong method. Moses' passion for justice, that was a good thing, but it wasn't guided by God. He thought he was kicking off his mission to be their deliverer, but what he was really doing was showing everybody and God just how unready he was. God's work, it has to be done God's way. And almost immediately, the consequences of him acting on his own strength start to pile up. His whole attempt to grab control and play the hero, it starts to completely fall apart. Literally, the next day, Moses tries to break up a fight between two of his own people, two Hebrews, and he gets hit with this devastating response. Imagine that. He probably expected them to be grateful, right? To see him as their champion. Instead, total rejection. The secret he tried to bury in the sand is out. And that question, who made you a prince over us? Ugh, that had to cut deep. It's a complete denial of any authority he thought he had. And just like that, the dominoes start to fall, and they fall fast. He goes from being a prince of Egypt to being rejected by his own people. Then he's exposed as a killer, and when Pharaoh gets word of it, he becomes a fugitive on the run for his life. His power, his security, his entire identity, it all just evaporates. But Moses' story of rejection, it's not some isolated incident. It's actually part of this bigger pattern you see all through the scriptures. Think about it. Joseph was rejected by his brothers. David was hunted by Saul, the prophets were ignored, and ultimately, Christ himself came to deliver his people, and they rejected him. So often, God's chosen servants are pushed away before they're ever received. So Moses runs, he flees for his life. But what looks like the tragic end of his story is, believe it or not, a brand new beginning. His exile isn't just a punishment, it's a preparation. Welcome to the Wilderness Workshop. For 40 years, 40, Moses lives as a nobody in the middle of nowhere. And get this, that's the exact same amount of time he spent living as a prince in Egypt. Just think about that whiplash. The man from the palace is now a forgotten shepherd in the desert. The man of action is now forced into decades of silence and waiting. So why the long wait? Why 40 years? Well, because God wasn't making a prince, he was making a shepherd.
See, the kind of leadership it takes to guide God's people, that can't be forged in the arrogance of a palace. It has to be formed in the quiet, humble dependence of the wilderness.
There's this fantastic summary of his life that goes something like this. Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. And that is the transformation that happens in the wilderness.
And this is such a huge takeaway for us, right? What looks and feels like epic failure in our lives is so often the very place where God is doing his deepest work, stripping away all our pride and self-reliance so that we can finally learn what it means to depend completely on him. Your wilderness, whatever it is, it's not meaningless.
And all of this brings us to the ultimate point of the story. It's this massive, beautiful contrast between what our own hands try so hard to accomplish and what only God's hands can do.
So think about this comparison. Where Moses takes a life in secret, acting in his own strength, Christ gives his life publicly, in perfect submission to God's will. Moses hides his mistake in the sand. Christ is raised from the grave for the whole world to see. Moses' flawed, failed attempt at deliverance only points us to a far greater, a far more perfect deliverance.
You know, the old hymn says it perfectly. At the end of the day, salvation doesn't come from the work of our hands. It's not about our strength. It's not about our brilliant plans or our perfect timing. It's about what God has already done for us. And that really brings us to the main idea of this whole story. It's this: even when we fail, even when we rush ahead of God and try to take matters into our own hands, he doesn't give up on his plan. He is still patiently, powerfully at work, shaping us and molding us to trust him more than we trust ourselves.
So I'll just leave you with this question to chew on. In our lives, in our work, in our faith, what if the whole point isn't really about what our hands have done or what they can ever hope to do, but about learning to rest in what his hands have already finished?